Hi, and welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, John Euler, as well as Dr. Ann Gillies, and our special guest, Laura Becker, who will be stopping in to discuss, well, going all the way from transitioning to detransitioning. There's a big story to tell, and we're going to get to that right after these.
Do you notice a change in your child? Do you wonder what's going on with my child? Do you finally see something others have been seeing for some time now? Do you see the ideology and indoctrination after your child returns home from school every day? Do you see? Yes, you do see the harm and the confusion they are causing. Do you see the role they are playing on your child's life and development? Do you see? Yes, you see now. And now you have questions. At Unmasking the Trans Movement, we're here to help answer those tough questions you can't ask anyone else, or answers that are hard to find. We discuss the many topics of this evil agenda indoctrinating our children into a world of self-destructive deviance, constant medical care, and human degradation. Our webinars provide access to supporting groups discussing the tough issues you want to talk about with real parents and experts alike. Sign up and become a member now and you'll save 30% off your first-time membership starting at just $7. Select from our bronze, silver, and gold packages, all with different options depending on your needs. Our mission is clear: to unmask the deception and protect the most vulnerable among us, women and children. For webinar dates, times, and pricing, please visit our website at unmaskingthetransmovement.com/webinars.
Welcome back. John Euler is standing by, but before we get to him, there's a lot that happens in the trans movement, and as that happens, there's been a lot of finger pointing and a lot of accusations about people who are against the movement. I make it clear here and now that at Unmasking the Trans Movement, we are not against the movement, but the movement is now taking aim at us. And as they do that, we want them to know that we're here to educate, help, and provide guidance for those that are struggling. It just might be you transitioning or you detransitioning like we have with Laura Becker on the show today. I think that's the most important part you need to know. This is about help, and that's first and foremost and on our minds. And with that, we bring the clinical experts and the broadcast guest experts, just like Laura today, to speak on behalf of themselves and for everyone who needs that help. With that, let's take it over to John Euler. John, I was going to let you do the disclaimer, but you know what? After I thought about it, it just makes sense to keep going in that direction because it's today's show is something that's very special, something that we haven't done here on the program yet. And, kudos to Laura Becker for being here and telling this story.
Brad, I couldn't agree more. We have a hero that's going to be on our program with us. And your disclaimer is appropriate because we need people to understand we're not anti anything except that which would place women and children and vulnerable populations at risk of being targeted by financial and sexual predators. It's as simple as that. Those in the healthcare industry, those in mental health, those in positions of people helping, the number one rule that we all have to abide by is do no harm. You can only do no harm if you are sure that informed consent is given. That has a couple of components. Can the person truly understand and appreciate what you are suggesting or what you are facilitating? If they can't, then you are doing harm. We are here to educate and we're here to protect. So that is extremely important because, again, people will try to make the case that we're phobic or we're not. We are here to inform. People are being harmed by lack of information so that they are dumbed down in terms of their own intuition and their ability to make an informed decision that will be in their own best interest. We feel strongly about that, and that's why Dr. Ann Gillies is here. I'm so thrilled. You and I are trauma professionals, and the one thing that survivors need more than anything is both clear and accurate factual information and support. And we have someone that has been harmed and someone that is a genuine survivor in multiple ways and has been willing to join us. So would you do the honors of introducing our fine guest?
Absolutely. I am so pleased to introduce Laura Becker today. Laura, this is going to be a very challenging interview. Also, an interview that's going to really open up a whole lot more discussion for people. And as we go along, we just want to affirm you, first and foremost, as a person, as a human being, because that's where affirmation starts. And I just want to applaud you for being courageous today. We're going to talk about detransitioning, but first we're going to talk about transitioning. Laura was in the cross-sex identifying place for about 6 years. So she comes with lots of information and unfortunately went through medicalization. So we're going to talk about that as well. So Laura, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And maybe we can just start way back, kind of pre-transitioning, and give us some background kind of on what you think really spurred you into this whole exploration of trans.
Well, thank you, Anne. That was a very moving introduction. So, I mean, essentially starting at the fundamental level, I was always a offbeat child. I use the term offbeat because it wasn't that I was so radically, different that I received interventions for it, but it was offbeat enough that it was causing difficulties. And what I mean by that is essentially having, a high functioning level of autism and autistic characteristics. I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum when I was 11 years old. And looking back on my early childhood, there was definitely vulnerabilities that even before I got the diagnosis at 11, there were certain factors that I always, from as early as kindergarten, I felt out of place with peers. I felt, not that I had the language at the time, but in reflection, a lot of existential questions. I'm a very cerebral person. The term gifted, some people don't like that term. I've come to appreciate it because there's certain, intellectual gifts that I had at the time, but also deficits in social and emotional regulation and relational interactions. So that's a hallmark of sort of a form of autism. And so those are sort of the factors that led into me being diagnosed when I was 11. Additionally, at 11, I was diagnosed with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. And although that isn't as talked about in regards to really just medical issues in general, but especially the gender issues, I've come to realize that the PCOS was an enormous factor for me. Having irregular periods, going through puberty very early, especially when you are autistic and you do have some social and emotional difficulties. You're a little bit more immature and developmentally offbeat. And going through puberty and those radical physical changes earlier than almost anyone else in your grade level, it was very, very disturbing to me. And with the irregular menstruation, it caused really severe mood problems. So essentially all of the typical natural developmental characteristics of puberty in terms of depression and anxiety and self-doubt and even existential questioning and all those sorts of things for young girls. I had that, but even more severe because of the intensity of the hormonal disturbances from the cysts on my ovaries and the autism. So that's sort of, you know, to sort of only talk about the negative parts of that. I mean, obviously there's positives to it too that I want to emphasize, because the high intellectual capabilities, the curiosity, sort of being a seeker of truth, a very creative person, in terms of personality theory, having a very high openness to experience, so being very divergent in thought and all those types of things, they can be really positive, in terms of artistry and being unique and independent thinking. But when you're young and insecure, it just makes you feel more alienated, and it's very hard for you to connect with other people, to feel connected to, you know, the human race in general. There's a really strong feeling of alienation. I felt alienated from kindergarten, and just enough that, you know, I'm going in school, I'm doing really well, you know, good grades. I, you know, have different talents and skills, writing and art and imagination, humor and things. But I did, there was just from an early age, there was a sense of that sort of instability that comes with being this very divergent person, and then not having a stable sense of self, you know, which is part of that kind of fluid creative, you know, persona. But then especially as a developing kid, just radically being destabilized, through puberty and the hormonal issues, and that caused a lot of social, even, you know, worsening social issues and deficits. um, the reason
I
I
want
talk about age 11, sorry, did you want to say
Oh,
something?
I was just going to say something, Laura, that what you're talking about is something I've certainly heard before, maybe John has too, but with young girls, young women, who get into the social groups. They're kind of invited or streamed into these social groups, where they because they're already struggling, and they want to belong. They just long to belong. And so there's this autistic, so a social, um, some difficulty socially connecting with others. And then the things that you said about puberty are exactly what I've heard before, like only at an even increased level of fear of going through puberty, the fear of becoming a woman and what all that means. And those are the things that it sounds to me like you were struggling with, the social anxiety and not quite fitting in. But I just want to clarify that you're probably, and you don't think about this as when you're young, perhaps, but that so many children feel that, right? It is pretty universal in one sense. There's times where none of us fit in. But I want to ask you, when you when you started then thinking about, um, perhaps that you didn't quite fit in your own body, when did that start?
Um, I mean, there's some time that I feel I should probably fill in, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of other things that led up to that. I started feeling not at home in my body, in terms of the gender, related distress, when I was probably about 15. But the from 11 to 15, that's when another element was introduced, which was abuse,
Oh,
from a family member. Um, Psychological, emotional, and verbal, abuse and manipulation, forms of emotional abandonment and neglect. Um, and that, you know, it's, you know, that, that's why I went into all of that backstory of even puberty, because all of that was going on, which made me very vulnerable and insecure to then basically develop PTSD. Because, you know, as we all know, not everyone who goes through a traumatic experience will develop PTSD or complex PTSD. But I think because I had these other factors and I was a very highly sensitive person, in terms of my nervous system and emotions, that combined with the abuse led me to develop complex PTSD, which I, of course, wasn't aware of. When I was in middle school and high school, I was diagnosed with PTSD when I was 22. So there was undiagnosed complex PTSD going on, in addition to those other factors, when I was in high school, when I was very socially alienated, had no real life friends, and I went online and I went on Tumblr, and Tumblr, a very creative, open minded community. I made connections on there, but on Tumblr, there's also a lot of kind of shallow intellectual discussion, like teenagers discussing politics and feminism. And that's where I started to learn about gender identity. And so it was around age 15 when I started to question my identity. And, I've always been very into personality theory and sort of categorizations and those types of things. So finding a gender identity, at first I started identifying as gender queer because to me, again, sort of that offbeat, androgynous. I was a tomboy, my entire life. And just, going, in high school, everyone's going through identity exploration, fashion exploration. For me, again, being a little bit offbeat, I was very mentally like stuck in the 1970s and 80s in terms of the music that I liked. And I'm dressing like 80s heavy metal fashion and my favorite band was Styx, and no one else, in that time had any concern for that, right? So
Yeah, that's
I'm,
called apparently classic rock. Why they call that classic, I don't know.
yeah,
Laura, let me also ask, I don't mean to interject, but oftentimes, now that you mention about gender queer, I think it's probably safe to say that anytime the word queer enters into it, you now have, not you yourself, but in the realm, a lot of sex and sexuality, issues of actual crossing of sexual boundaries enters into that. Had you experienced any of that prior to this?
in terms of crossing of sexual boundaries, no, but I was
Or somebody crossing yours?
no, but I was consuming a lot of porn, um, in my own, being, on the internet a lot. Had a
And
very
how
high sex
early,
drive.
can I ask how early you were exposed to pornography?
I want to say probably 12.
Yeah.
And I started watching it regularly from at least 14 or so on. Um, and, I sort of just in hindsight realized that a lot of, the hypersexuality, that I wasn't acting on it in terms of with other people, but in my own sort of, masturbation and things, that was a form of attachment disorder, that sort of sexual hyperfocus and romantic hyperfocus, was to compensate for the lack of, safe and secure, relational attachments at that time. Um, so there hadn't been sexual abuse, but there was definitely sexuality involved. Um, and, my understanding, as this very naive, 15-year-old girl, when people are using the term genderqueer, you're not thinking in terms of queer theory. You're not thinking about the adults that are propagating that. I'm thinking in a very straightforward way, like queer means a little weird. It means a little unique. It means a little different. And, now that I've, studied more about queer theory and postmodernism, obviously that takes on a different connotation of, maybe who was writing these posts on Tumblr or trickling down these ideas that youth are normalizing that term.
Can you just explain for our viewers what your concept and what you understand that term to actually rightfully mean? Because I think that's helpful.
Queer. Um, so in so queer in that definition would mean basically a deconstruction and a destabilization of, um, values, norms, ethics, um, even just the reality itself, putting into question that there is any sort of truth at all, that anything can be subverted to suit anyone's needs, and it's a very language based system. So if you just, for example, like an insidious example would be an adult saying, I am a 5 year old, therefore I can have sex with a 5 year old because I am a 5 year old, because it's subjective. That's an example of that.
I do sex offender treatment, 3 groups per week. And that is, you said that extremely well. For the young person who's on the receiving end of that, oftentimes young kids will either interpret that as positive attention, we have a special relationship, or they're being overwhelmed. The more sophisticated the perpetrator, the more they're going to play upon a child's felt needs. And so the child believes they are special. The perpetrator, meanwhile, is using all of that, especially they identify. Whenever you have a man, just throw this out, whenever you have a man online or anywhere that says, I identify as a young person, right? All things being equal, he's playing you. He has designs for that. That's okay. You identify with a young person, then guess what? You identify with a young person with people your own age. I'm speaking to men out there. Don't you dare use that as the classic means of gaining access to vulnerable kids. You stay with adult men. That's my message to men that are going to try to use that. Especially we see now there's a big push. We're seeing a lot online, men dressing up as kids, if not in diapers. People need to understand those are deviant men that are highly porn saturated, and they're using that because it's so off-put. It catches people off guard. Nobody dresses like that, and that's what they count on. It's like the big lie theory, and so they're using that. They're confusing people's intuition. Meanwhile, they are laughing all the way to the bank. They're getting close to their targets of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to ask you this. When I think of queer and queering, like there is a queering of all values that seems to be happening with, this whole queer theory. Like, so queering of any parental attachments, queering of parental values, any kind of religious or spiritual values the child might have. It's like everything that the child perhaps has learned in early childhood, if they've had a fairly decent childhood at least, is just turned absolutely upside down. Is that kind of how you see it as well? Is that what you think happens with queering, queering heteronormativity, right? All of those things. Yeah.
That's definitely what I think as well, and definitely what I experienced. And I'm trying to give the perspective of that, 15, 16, 17-year-old who's, intellectual, but they're naive and inexperienced, and they're thinking like, oh, we're going to throw out these systems, we don't need the heteronormativity, the patriarchy, all religion is bullshit, all conservatives are, assholes, and, very shallow analysis of, how the world works, which is typical for teenagers, but it's insidious because there are so many links to the body modifications, to say the least. I view it sort of as a body modification cult, not the entire. It's very complicated, the why people transition and these different identities, but some parts of it I do think of as a body modification cult, where it is a spiritual practice that they're going through to try and go through these rituals, to sort of transform into the new self, to be born again in a very religious way. For me, there is definitely that going on. Like I like to say, people sometimes ask, like, why did you want to be a man? Why were you identifying as trans? And I always say, well, why would I want to be myself? Why would you want to be a traumatized young woman who feels disgusting and worthless and unlovable? Why would you want to be that person? You're going to look for ways to escape that. I escaped it through drugs and alcohol as a teen, you know, sleeping, food, magical thinking, like parasocial relationships with celebrities, like so many different ways to escape. And yet, of course, it wasn't really fulfilling that void of attachment and, self-respect and even a spiritual sort of sense of universal oneness or different things. And so that's, it became more pervasive as I grew older and things became more complicated. And I started to encounter sort of my attachment issues really manifesting. A big part of it for me was when I had 3 subsequent unrequited loves, obsessions, limerent situations with gay male friends of mine. Just getting attached to people who were around, males who were around, and going as teenagers, we're all sort of, this is sort of the naivete of this mindset as a teen was, okay, I'm a female, you're a male, but we're both identifying as genderqueer and we're best friends. And then I fall in love with you, but you don't fall in love with me. And I can't understand that. So that's the level of sort of magical thinking or just, illusion that I had and that even my friends had, the gay male friends that, were sort of leading me on in things because it was very idealistic that we would just transcend sex and transcend sexuality and the physical form, and it would be very spiritual. But in reality, this is a homosexual male and I'm a heterosexual female, and there's a lot of attachment trauma going on. And so I had 3 of those in a row, and each one I got so much more suicidal. I was having suicidal ideation every day.
Laura, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me ask, when you said a few moments ago, you said those relationships, those men were leading you on, meaning did those relationships become sexual?
No, they were not sexual, but they were physical, in terms of cuddling, physical affection, hand holding. But it was very one-sided, as in, I would always be sort of the active partner, that I would give them a massage or, spoon them or whatever, but they would never return that to me. And these were peers. These were people my own age, as teenagers. So I don't view them as being malevolent, but I do view them as using me. And I consider it to be abusive, because I was so suicidal, and they were very aware of that.
And they could tell that you were attracted.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was, I had no boundaries whatsoever. I would try, text them long messages and tell them all these things, about my yearning. And, I'm like a poet and an artist, so I'm very, romantic and intense about it. And they were well aware of it.
So this is really interesting. I don't know, have you heard of peer orientation attachment? It's very, it's interesting because as you're talking, you're describing where how attachment injury in earlier years, it 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 reduces. Well, I don't know if it makes you more naive, but there's an immaturity, right? Because perhaps it's you choose to attach at some level with peers rather than and get your instruction from peers, get your emotional tank filled up from peers, or you're attempting to do that. And so it's like this peer orientation attachment. And instead of going to the people, usually your parent, one parent or another, that is your primary attachment from childhood, who is there to defend you and protect you, something gets skewed. And it sounds like that's what happened for you. And then you are so vulnerable. You were so vulnerable. And these other peers, for their own reasons, right, just really took advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what happened. I mean, even at the time, I was kind of joking a lot. That they were my one attachment figure. They were everything to me. Mother, father, brother. partner, everything.
That's dangerous, isn't it? Because
It is, yeah. I don't recommend it.
they're very immature in their own self. Like here are children trying to provide attachment, secure attachment to one another. It never works.
Right. And so that's why I don't view them as being malevolent, because there's no way they were going to be able to handle my emotional needs in that level. But also, I needed things from them that they wouldn't provide. And so they were withholding things while also using me for other things. And that was unethical. They shouldn't have done that. Um, and so those, again, there was three of them, one at 14, one at 17, and one at 18. And when I was 18 is when I started identifying as trans, a transgender, transsexual, gay man. And I started wearing a binder. I had very large breasts. I started wearing a binder. And things just continued to get worse. I went to college, and it was a very lonely time, and very suicidal. Um, and I kind of tried to fight, these things, these obsessions, these romantic obsessions. There was a lot of porn involved. Like, I started watching gay porn because it represented my attachment figures. And, it was just excruciatingly painful to be so suicidal and feel like the only hope of salvation, and the salvation fantasy of your one attachment figure sort of rescuing you, but that one attachment figure cannot do it, and they continue to push you away and reject you more and more. And then meanwhile, I'm sort of trying to get over it, so I'm using a lot of drugs, and I'm trying to socialize with other people, but I'm very naive and very depressed, so I'm not taking the best care of myself. I'm just not really myself. There's a lot of trauma going on. I'm hooking up with.
Lauren, can I ask, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but this is such an important point. It almost feels like, as you're talking, I'm picturing this young woman, as you said, you're now in college, you're binding. People need to understand that is just a massive compression bandage, right? And it creates harm, great harm, potentially life-threatening for young people. Would it be fair to say it was almost as though a part of you was willing to sacrifice whatever it took to try to gain their attention? You're a young lady. You're attracted to these gay guys. They're not paying. They sort of, one could say, since they knew, and you said they knew they were leading you on, so they were bringing you along emotionally, and then weren't allowing you to connect. After bringing you along, they're sort of leading you along. And so what does this young lady do? Well, if I'm a gay guy, then we can be together. Would that have entered into that young woman's mind named Laura? Was that part of, do you think?
Yeah, that was definitely part of it. I don't want to put too much emphasis on that because, again, there was such a sort of fractured sense of self for so long. But that was certainly part of it, where I was kind of like, okay, I'm having this, I've never belonged as a woman. This is my thought process at the time. I've never belonged as a woman. I have a more similar personality to a gay man. I'm very, androgynous. I have more of a male typical sexuality. I, don't think that I think I would be more accepted, loved, and respected if I was a gay man versus this straight woman that I am. And in addition to that, I then would become more attractive to the population that I have this affinity for and with.
That's right. That's what I was thinking too. It just totally makes, it doesn't make any sense, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
That fair?
That describes that time, yeah.
And Laurie, we've just started because you're bringing us right to the point where somehow the introduction of the idea that if you were to medicalize yourself, then it would actually enhance or improve things. And you started to move toward that trajectory. So would you be willing to stay with us and continue sharing your story and then giving the insights that you've gained.
Certainly.
It's invaluable. People need to understand that it's such a complex issue, speaking of complex trauma, but to help people understand that to simply have a young person come into an office saying, I don't want to be a girl, I wish I was a boy, and to not begin to allow that young person to explore, but just simply to say, oh, okay, well, off to the medical doctor you go, is such a travesty. And we are tasked with, those in the mental health or professional or medical field, we're tasked with doing no harm. I can actually do harm by omission, by not inquiring, including if a young person is being perped on. I need to know those warning signs so I can begin to ask those questions. Dr. Angeles, Laura's story is extremely compelling.
This has been really, really good, Laura. Thank you for being so open, and I'm really looking forward to the next session when we talk about what were the next steps, because I think those are going to be very important for people to understand, both teenagers, children, but also the parents and grandparents, because perhaps there's somewhere along the line that they can reignite the attachment strategies with that child once again. So thank you, Laura. And Brad, over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Dr. Ann and John. Wow, what a story, and there's so much more to tell. How old are you now, Laura? Let me just ask that.
I'm 26 now.
Okay, so we're at about the 18-year-old phase, and we'll be moving into your adulthood now, and obviously a lot happens going forward, and I'm compelled to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much for being here today. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Until next time, remember, it's not your kids' fight, it's our fight. I'll see you soon.